Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, thanks for listening. It's Mike and Davina here, and welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. Today's episode is awesome. Aren't they all, though? I feel like I say the same things in every intro because I'm always so pumped after I do these interviews with people. I always learn so much great stuff, and I think that everybody I talk to is just, they're all super helpful. They all share a ton of great knowledge, and I have so much fun with these. So I'm hoping you're enjoying these episodes. But today's episode's a really fun one too. I'm interviewing Brian Moncarz, which Brian is an awesome engineer out of the Toronto area who has worked with bands like Our Lady Peace, Moneen, Circa Survive, The Tea Party, and a whole bunch of awesome bands. And he's got a really deep history in production, learning from guys like Bob Ezrin and David Bottrill. And we get into some of those stories later on in the episode. And he also shares some really cool stories about working with some of the bigger bands that he's worked with and giving some insight into their productions. So I really enjoyed this episode. Brian's such a cool guy, and I was happy to have him on here. So yeah, let's not waste any time. Let's just jump right into this episode. Brian, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
No problem. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So for people who might not know your history and how you got into mixing and engineering and producing, can you give us a little bit of that story?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I came up as a guitar player, writing songs, playing in bands. And then by the time I got to university, I really started taking a liking to being in the studio. I was always the guy in the band that requested to sit in on mixes. And I loved the process of being in the studio. And it started to get to the point where I kind of enjoyed it more than even playing my instrument. And I knew that it was something that I'd have to pursue. I was fortunate that I went to Ryerson for Radio and Television Arts in Toronto in the early 90s. And although there wasn't like a huge musical component to the course, we did have a few multi-track studios, and I would sort of sneak in on the weekends and during the summers with my professor's blessing, and would record bands and just really fell in love with it all. So that's kind of how I got my start in it. Just being involved, from the musician's perspective, and then transitioning over, to the other side of the glass and being the engineer and eventually producer and mixer.
Awesome. And what instrument did you play?
I play guitar. That's my primary instrument. I still do, but time doesn't really allow me to practice as much as I'd like.
That is the downside to getting into this kind of stuff, right? Like it takes you away from your playing, but you're coaching people through it, I guess, right?
Exactly. I get my musical fix. It's all good.
Yeah, for sure. How do you think that your ability to play guitar has influenced the work that you do now?
I think in terms of, just understanding the musicians that I'm working with and being able to talk to them, from a musician's standpoint, and not just, the producer that's kind of barking orders at them. I think I can identify with them a little bit better. And it also, being in love with the guitar and playing, I started playing when I was in grade 6. So, music has been a huge part of my life. And that sort of, that's been it's been a huge influence on my career, on my life outside of the studio, on my life inside the studio. I just sort of live and breathe music. And I think that passion always comes across when I'm working with bands. They can see, just how excited I get to sort of get my hands on their songs. And, whether it's producing, whether it's mixing, I'm equally as excited, and they feed off of that. So it's really great.
For sure. And so you had mentioned you were at Ryerson for studying radio stuff and then getting into the studios and recording bands. Like, how did you learn about producing bands and the mixing process? Because that's got to be a little different from radio, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's very different. I mean, I just in high school I sort of envisioned that I would have a career in radio because I did like an internship at Q107 and then stayed on after, and it's kind of where I learned a little bit of Pro Tools and really got my feet wet of being in studios, although we were recording commercials, so it was very different. But yeah, I mean, in terms of learning production, I think you're always learning. I mean, I would say that 18 or 19 years in now, I'm still learning. I had, having been in bands that recorded before with other producers, I sort of had an idea of what it meant to be a producer. And I through a lot of like trial and error, at first I sort of started out on my own, but then about 4 years into my career, I met Bob Ezrin, who was incredibly generous with his time with me, and really took me under his wings and taught me a lot about production and mixing too. We spent an awful lot of time. He spent an awful lot of time critiquing my mixes for like several months. And, I really learned what it meant to sort of focus and use my ears and really like search for a sound and then commit that sound, through a mix or through a recording.
Yeah. Well, having a guy like Bob Ezrin evaluating your mixes has to be equally intimidating as educational, right?
It was a trip. I mean, I'm so fortunate. I think those types of mentorship opportunities don't exist that much anymore. And I just sort of met him at the right time in my career where I had things going on. I was working on a project for a band called The Junction that were signed to Universal at the time. And I sort of met him through that. And so he really just really helped kind of get my career, or maybe push fast forward on my career a little bit and jumpstart things a little bit for me, which was awesome.
For sure. Yeah. I remember, one of my early mentors was Jack Richardson, who he worked very closely with Bob.
Sure.
So, I remember like the same sort of feeling as maybe you experienced, like trying to show him my first mix and be like, hey man, like you want to check this out? And like, and just like feeling like you're going to get shot down. But for me, it was a great experience and I learned a lot from him. And I'm sure likewise with you, with Bob, like you probably learned tons.
Oh, yeah, it was invaluable. But mostly it was just training my ears to hear how things should sound, just in terms of the bigness, the richness, it's very subjective. I'm sure there's mixes that I hear that I think could be improved. And there's mixes that I love that maybe other people aren't feeling. So it is so subjective, but he was really good at sending me back like hard notes. And he's brutally honest, which is, I think, what you need in a situation like that. And it was like over the course of a bunch of months, and I would keep sending stuff and he would keep, critiquing and we would go back and forth. And then one day it was just like, I got that email where it was like, man, this sounds really good. you nailed it. And it was so satisfying because he had been so hard on me and not so much hard on me as just being real, which I think is what we need.
Yeah. If you had to kind of summarize Bob's philosophy on mixing and what he, or at least what he was teaching you, is there a way that you could do that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this was like 2004, so it was a long time ago. But I think my relationship sort of continued over the years with Bob. I mean, we don't speak as much as we used to, but every now and again we'll email or jump on a phone call. But I think with Bob, a lot of it is about the song, because Bob is tremendous songwriter in his own right, and so for him, and I think his philosophy is really revolved around, whatever you do in the mix needs to really serve the song. And that's something that I've sort of carried over to the mixes that I've been doing recently, and well, throughout my career, really. I mean, it always comes down to having a great song.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely something that I feel like that's the Jack Richardson influence on him too, because I've told this story on my podcast before, but the first time I showed Jack a mix, I was like, "Hey man, can you do you mind just giving this a listen?" And he was like, "Sure, but if the song sucks, what difference does the mix make?" And like,
that's so true.
So yeah, like after that, I've always just kept that in the back of my mind. Like it is so true. Like there's no amount of mixing is going to fix a bad song.
No, totally.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
Yeah. And you've also had the ability to work with guys like David Bottrill as well, right?
So yeah, I mean, again, super fortunate in my career, over the last 20 years. So after my time with Bob had sort of run its course a little bit, he was living in Toronto while he was mentoring me. And he took a job with Live Nation and had to move to Miami. And at that time, David Bottrill had moved back to Toronto. And Bob, I think, and this might be the greatest thing that he ever did to help me, actually. I think Bob felt that I was, super creative and good producer and was getting my mixing chops down. But I think he felt as though I could improve my engineering chops overall. And so he really wanted to introduce me to David because Bob would always tell me that in his eyes, David was one of the best engineers out there. So Bob did that. He set up a meeting and Dave hired me to engineer a record for a band that's called We Are the Take, which we did over a couple weeks together. And then, we became like super fast friends. I mean, Dave's such an amazing guy. We got along so well. And he really just, I remember we went out for coffee and he's like, "I got a bunch of other projects, would you work on them with me?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And he was at that point, because we're getting along, so I was very open with his knowledge. And I really wanted to learn how to make like heavier rock records because I came up as a musician sort of loving blues and roots-based music and Motown and soul. And so I wasn't really, I listened to heavy stuff, but when I was working, I wasn't really working on heavy stuff. And Dave is like the master of that. So to have him open my eyes and ears to those types of sounds and how you make guitar sound massive and how you get the drums to like sit within those massive guitars and all the things he taught me over the years were, was absolutely incredible. But my experience with Dave kind of continued because we ended up opening a studio together called Rattlebox. He needed a place to work and I was in a lease that was expiring and we really enjoyed working together. So we found a spot in downtown Toronto and opened Rattlebox and worked there for 3 years together. I engineered for him. Around that time though, like my own production career was taking off. So I'd kind of have to go find another studio to work out of because Dave would be working in the studio and, I couldn't engineer as much for him. And, it just sort of, we worked so much and such long hours, and it sort of became clear that I needed to sort of transition my studio closer to my house because I was living very north of the city. So after 3 years, we sort of parted ways, and I guess that would have been, I don't know, maybe 2008 or 2009. But we still, we talk all the time. He's one of my best friends.
Awesome. So tell me about your studio setup now. Like what are you using these days?
So right now I'm based out of a studio close to Uxbridge.
Okay.
Which is about 45 minutes outside of Toronto. A studio called Chalet that's been here for like 30 years. It's an amazing spot on 40 acres of land. So I actually have like, when I look outside my window, there's like forest.
That's amazing.
It's pretty inspiring. So I sort of took over their B room, which I converted into my mix room, and I can do some overdubs here. And they have a wonderful A room for tracking bands live off the floor, which I've been doing a ton of lately, or just getting drum tracks, and everything else I can kind of do in my room. I'm pretty much all in the box these days in terms of mixing. Huge fan of Universal Audio and all those plugins.
Oh yeah, they're great.
Which has been a massive game changer for me. And I recently just switched over from Avid interfaces to Apollo interfaces. So that's been an exciting change for me. A little scary because I've been, working with Avid for my entire career, and, literally 3 months ago made the switch, but it's been amazing. And then of course I've got a bunch of mic pre's and compressors and mics and tools that I need when I'm recording. But I am doing a fair amount of mixing these days. So really it's a very simple setup. Everything's in the box other than I come out of the box and print my mix through a Burl B2 Bomber. It's the one piece of analog gear that's sort of left over from mixing out of the box that I just can't seem to find a suitable digital equivalent to replace it. And the Burl, I don't know if you're familiar with the B2 Bomber, but
I haven't used it, no.
It's an analog to digital converter, but it has a really nice transformer in it with a gain stage. So I literally just turn the gain almost full and then just mix into it. And it just becomes a part of my sound. So it's hard to mix without it.
Yeah. What would you say it's adding to the sound then?
It adds a fair amount of color, but what it does really that I like is it's kind of like a glue. It smooths the transients because of the way I'm hitting it. It sort of allows me, it compresses in a way without, being heavy-handed with any sort of compression. So I try to, I obviously I'll use a mix bus compressor still. Sometimes I use a limiter at the end of everything. But this kind of just puts that last little bit of like finish. To me, it sounds like when I used to mix through consoles. It kind of has that sort of sound when I mix through it. So
that's very cool.
It's an exciting piece that I don't know. I think it's always going to have to live there.
There's always some sort of secret recipe, right? Until UA makes a version of it or something.
Yeah, I think it would be hard because it's a like an A to D converter, so it's not even, unless they made the transformer. But I don't think it's just the transformer that like has the sort of special mojo. I think it's like the whole unit. So I don't know. It's a strange piece, but
it could happen. Yeah,
you never know.
Awesome. Well, I'm curious to talk a little bit about your production and when you're producing bands too, because I know you do a bunch of that as well.
Yes.
And I was wondering, like, when you're producing, how involved do you like to get in that process? Like, do you get involved in the songwriting side of it, or are you working on more like maybe arrangements or just getting tones? Like, what do you think your role is?
I think my role typically is whatever is necessary to get the best finished product. So typically I work with bands. I don't know how it happened, but I really get the band dynamic. I don't work as much with singer-songwriters, although it's something I'd love to do because it's sort of a little bit outside of my normal day-to-day activities as a producer. So, when bands come to me, they usually have a collection of songs. They might be in different states. So sometimes I'm involved in the songwriting, but more often than not, it's more like song doctoring. It's more of an arrangement thing or coming up with, extra ideas, counter melodies, harmonies, guitar parts. I really like to, I like to spend a lot of time in a rehearsal space on pre-production and really making sure that the songs are where they need to be, really making sure that all the parts that the musicians are playing are sort of correct and feeling really good and that they're excited playing the parts. I really don't like, I don't like imparting my will on bands per se, because I always say to them, like, you're the ones that have to get up on stage and play these songs, not me. So when you leave me and my direction, you have to feel good about it. But I'm also getting hired, because I have done it for almost 20 years. So, I have a pretty good understanding of what might make an exciting arrangement. And I find a lot of bands are really open-minded to collaborating and making those sort of necessary changes to get the songs to be exciting.
Yeah, for sure. So when you're doing your pre-production, I assume that that's kind of where a lot of the biggest changes would happen and all that stuff. What common mistakes or maybe songwriting structure issues do you typically see in that stage?
A lot of times, and I mean, this is probably more true with younger bands, more sort of developing bands. A lot of times, bands aren't asking themselves an important question, which is, does this serve the song? I mean, when I'm arranging songs for bands, I'm really looking at what's going to hold the listener's attention. And especially in this day and age where, we're definitely driven by playlists and singles and people that are fans of music don't necessarily have the patience that maybe I had when I was younger and would put vinyl on. So we really need to make sure that the songs are concise and to the point and they don't meander, unless meandering is what the song requires. If I was going to produce like the Allman Brothers, I don't think I'd want to have 2-minute and 30-second songs, because what makes that band special is the jamming. So again, that's why I say what serves the song best. There are some songs where if you cut out a chunk to make a radio edit, the song wouldn't make sense anymore. And not every band that I work with is going after radio. Although in Canada, there's sort of still the need to or drive to want to get to radio, because it can really help promote a band, obviously. But yeah, for me, the common mistake is not asking yourself, like, does this serve the song? Is there a reason why this 1-minute guitar solo in the middle of this really great hooky song needs to be there? And don't get me wrong, I'm a guitar player. I love guitar solos, but my thing is, if we're going to put a guitar solo in, it has to be as hooky as any other part of the song. It has to be some sense of melody that the listener can grab onto. Because at any point you have to think that someone's going to hit skip. And I think the objective really is to not hit skip, get someone to listen from start to finish, and not just start to finish, but say, hey, wait a second, that was really cool. I need to hear that again, and how do you do that? So,
yeah, definitely. In terms of, you were talking about like crafting songs so that they hold people's attention. I think that, like, just at least in my experience, like one of the issues that I see a lot of songwriters have is that just musicians in general, is that they think everything's important, right? Like they're like, you're talking about that like minute-long guitar solo. A guitar player is thinking like, fuck yeah, I'm awesome. I'm just ripping this wicked solo and everyone's going to love this, right? And it's like, how do you convince somebody that like they need to trim that down?
I think that comes with experience, really. I just spent a bunch of time with Jeff Martin from the Tea Party in the studio. Although I wasn't producing, I was mixing. They had recorded the tracks for their new record in his studio in Australia, and then sent me the files. And then he, on a break from their North American tour, he came to the studio for a few days and we sort of went through everything. And he's a wicked guitar player, super intelligent songwriter, but he was really good at, cutting things out. He would say like, I don't think we need this part. And we would literally like axe parts out of the songs. And, he was like his own amazing filter. And I think it's just, he's been doing it for so long. I think he just really understands, what it means to have a really great song that his fan base can, sink their teeth into. And I just think with young bands, it comes with experience. And so because they don't necessarily have that experience yet under their belts, bringing in an outside producer, someone like me or whoever it is, that can help guide them. But they need to be able to trust that, I'm helping them make the right decisions, and they need to be very open-minded. I think for me, I'm a pretty great judge of character, and I can kind of get myself into a room with people and know pretty quickly if they're going to be open to, what it is that I want to do with their music. And if it's, if they're not so open, then I know it's going to be a struggle, and maybe it's not the right time for them to be taking on a producer. Not to be negative in any sort of way. I love working with developing acts. That's something that I'll always love doing. To me, it's exciting to take a young band and, guide them through the process, and hopefully, they keep coming back and we kind of get to grow together. That to me is really exciting. But they need to 100% be open-minded, to at least trying what I'm asking.
For sure. I feel like as producers, like we're educators, like people come to us because they think we're going to get the right tones, but the things that they walk away with afterwards aren't just the recording. It's more of the lessons of like you said, being able to critically look at your song and analyze like where can you trim the fat, and like what do you need to work on between like kick and bass or stuff like that, like locking in elements, right? And like I think that that's ultimately what a producer brings, and a lot of new bands, like the first time they work with somebody, they're almost like offended that you're like trying to trim the fat and all this and that, but like at the end they kind of make sense, right?
Totally. And the best thing, the most satisfying thing for me with working alongside developing acts is the second time we work together, I can see how much they listened to my guidance with the first batch of songs, because I can see that they've sort of put it through like the Moncarz filter, and they're like, what would Brian ask of us? And they would just do it naturally. And that to me is exciting, because they're open-minded and they're learning, and it's great. And I also learn, I learn from young bands as well. I've been doing it a long time, so sometimes it's hard to find inspiration, but when you work with younger acts that are like really excited, and they're constantly introducing me to new bands and new music, things that I hadn't really heard of. And that to me is like insanely inspiring. So
that's awesome. Yeah. I guess you may have already answered this question, but I guess in your opinion, what ends up making a good song? That's
a pretty tough question. I think what makes a good song is a connection, really. A connection from the musician into the song, and then from the song to the listener. Like my favorite songs, the songs that I keep coming back to, that like I can't go a week without listening to, for one reason or another, I connect to it. And whether it's a lyrical thing, whether it's a melodic thing, whether it's a groove thing, and I think there's a lot of factors that go into that type of connection that you have. And sometimes it's unexplained. Like there's just songs in my life that I'll listen to and kind of like, reminds me of a time in my life that I loved, or reminds me of a time in my life that maybe, was a little more difficult, but still sort of necessary to put myself through those feelings. So I think to me, it's a connection. Not every song you're going to have a connection with. But if I can find a connection within the songs that I'm producing, then I think at the end of the day, we end up with a better product. So I think really the answer to that question for me is just the connection.
Yeah. And so for songs that you're not feeling a connection with, are those the ones that you would typically tell a band, like, this just isn't working, like this isn't the song, or do you just leave it to them because they feel like they have a connection to it, right?
Right. I think you can tell pretty quickly, like what the motivation is behind a band writing a song. If they're just writing a song because they want to have like a massive hit, to me, that motivation is, it serves a purpose, but it doesn't necessarily serve a purpose for me. But if it's an honest thing that obviously, they've put a lot of time into, and maybe even though I don't connect to it, it's definitely something I would give time to. And then hopefully at the end of it, I would end up with some sort of connection to it, having sort of had my hand in it. I certainly, I don't know how many songs I've ever worked on over 18 years. It's got to be a lot. I'm sure that there's been songs where, I started out not having that connection, but once my name goes on it and I've had an influence on that song, then I have a bit of a connection to it. But then there's definitely like, bands send me songs where like instantly I get connected to something where it's just like, holy shit, I have to work on this. I have to get this job. I have to take this on, and it becomes a very passionate thing. And it happens, it happens more often than not. People that are close to me that know me know how excited I get about things and over the top. So it's not hard for something to connect with me. I'm very open to it.
That's awesome. Well, it just makes the whole experience of working on those songs that much better if like the person working on them is connected to it and is just as excited about it,
Well, yeah, we spend so much time. I mean, like so much time in the studio, outside of the studio. I'm usually mixing, I would say I mix 99% of the projects that I produce. So I'm like from start to finish, it's like days on a song. So it does definitely help to feel good about that song and to have that connection. And again, not every song is going to be a hit, and bands are still making records. And I really enjoy, working on those album tracks where you can maybe get a little quirky with things and, sort of expand and on parts a little bit more. And I think the sort of common factor or I guess common thing that unites sort of all the projects that I work on is great musicianship. For whatever reason, I tend to attract bands that can really play.
That's a good thing to have.
Yeah, I'm so fortunate. I mean, so you can push them and tell them and ask them to do things that they're fully capable of doing. And it gets really exciting. So yeah, I mean so even that musical connection, just to be able to relate to the bands and have them really, push them super hard in the studio, but also be inspired by the sheer musicianship that's like in front of me is awesome.
Yeah, for sure. You had mentioned that you're doing a lot more mixing these days. So I'm curious to talk a little bit more about your mixing process.
Yeah.
When you're getting started with a mix, like what's your mindset going into that? Like, where do you start? What's your focus?
So I'm very goal oriented when it comes to mixing. For me personally, I find that sort of going into a mix with a little bit of an end game in mind, I think can go a long way, because then you're always mixing with a purpose instead of just like turning knobs and pushing faders until something sounds good. To give you an example, I got to mix the latest Our Lady Peace album, Somethingness. I mixed a good chunk of that record, and including the first single, Drop Me in the Water. And when they sent me the files, I was fortunate that I had seen them play it live before, so I kind of knew the energy in that song, and it's quite an aggressive song, and there's parts of it that will really remind their fan base of some of their older material, but still sounding like pretty modern and fresh. So that to me was an approach and a goal that I kept in mind the whole time I was mixing. And it was, let's make this sound modern and current, but let's also have aspects of the sonic characteristics that would remind the fan base of all the old songs that they loved. And then again, I think that helps, going back to connections, that helps connect the song to a fan base. So that's kind of where I start. I have these ideas in my head of where I want to see a song go. I get my Pro Tools session up and running with like sort of a rough balance. And then I just start working on it.
Yeah. No, I like what you said about seeing the band live, because I think that's so true. That like sometimes you see a band live and it just creates this whole other life or shape to the song. I can think of like a band recently that approached me to work with some stuff. Like they sent me their demo, and the demo just sounded very like dry and raw. And then I saw them live recently, and it was like, holy shit! Like there's like a whole other attitude to the song live. So
right?
It makes you want to shape the song in a different way, right?
It 100% does. It always does. And yeah, I'm just that's just I find that it helps me, because otherwise it could take days to finish a mix, because you're really like, you're searching. And I find that if I have a goal in mind, it could be anything. But if I ask myself, is this is what I'm doing now leading me closer to that goal? And if the answer is no, then I know I need to move away and try something else. But if the answer is yes, then I can keep going. And for whatever reason in my mind, it just helps me, be motivated and mix fast, make quick decisions.
So how long does it normally take you to finish most mixes then?
It all depends what it is and how tricky it is. I find these days there's a lot of production that ends up happening in mixes. I'm not just mixing, I'm being sent like extra guitar parts and extra keyboard parts and percussion and things. And I'm sort of, I get the instruction of, use what you want to use. So then all of a sudden you're not just mixing, but you're helping like shape the song in a way. Sometimes it's rearranging songs. I've definitely been involved in mixes where you're like, at the end, you start cutting parts out, or, duplicating parts and creating new things. And so I think like if it was just a straight up mix, like here are the files, go to work, it's usually a day a mix. If it's like a live off the floor blues record or something like that, then I'm probably 2 or 3 a day I could do. But if it's, its own beast, where I really need to be careful and take the time to get the tones to be right and do all the things that I love to do in a mix, it's usually a day. Typically what I'll do is mix all day, go home, rest, give my ears a break, and come back the next morning, give one final listen, and then send it off to the band, and then then start working on the second song.
Yeah. It's interesting that you were talking about kind of producing in the mixing stage, because, most people think of it as like this linear path where, you record, or you're producing it, you record it, you edit, you mix. So when it comes to those kind of sessions where you're doing that production role, how do you stay focused with it? Because like you could do all sorts of work to make that mix finish and like, kind of reproduce the song and arrange it and all that stuff. But then like you might send it off to the band and they're like, well, what did you do with our song? Right. Like, do you ever experience that? Or like, do you have like a process that you handle or you follow with those kind of specific projects?
Yeah, I usually won't cut things up without talking to the band first. Sometimes it comes from the band. Sometimes, they'll have listened to a rough mix for a long time and realize like, well, wait a second, this bridge is like double the length it needs to be, and then they'll sort of, they'll get me to take care of it. Other times, I'll listen and then I'll call the band and say, look, I have this idea of an arrangement that might work a little bit better and be a little bit more exciting. Do you mind if I try it out and see what you think? And 9 times out of 10, when I do that and they listen, they're like, yeah, that's cool. We never thought of that. Every once in a while it's like, no, we dig what we did and let's stick to it. And I mean, it's their prerogative. They're hiring me as a mixer, not as a producer, but my production chops, I think, come to light a lot when I'm mixing, and it's funny because you mentioned like the linear process, which is definitely, when I started out in 2000 and I was mixing on a console, to Tascam D88 machines, it was very linear. It was like, here's the recording and here's the mix. And you never did any additional recording in the mix process. It was like you stripped your patch bay from recording, you set up to mix, and then you went at it. But nowadays, it's weird the way we've come, because there's a lot of bands that I've worked with that have like really great home studios, and they'll do these demos that when I get to them, I'm like, wow, this sounds really good. And a lot of times we'll end up using certain things from those demos will like appear on the actual master. So now it's like we're kind of jumping back and forth, and it's interesting to me that it's almost a lot more collaborative than it used to be, which in certain ways can be really exciting, but in other ways, it might hold people back a little bit, just in terms of having the ability to change things in the mix. I try I try to do my best from a production standpoint when I'm working with a band to guide that band to a point where when I print a rough mix, it's pretty much how that track is going to be. And then I just go in and do the things to sort of sonically enhance and sweeten the mix from the rough mix. But every once in a while, even I'll listen and think like, oh, wait a second. I wish we had recorded this extra guitar part, or I wish there was this harmony thing. And I'll bring the band back in and say like, okay, I've got this mix, but I think it could use this extra part. And, we'll do it. So it's very different than it was, but in a way, I think a little bit more exciting.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you kind of mentioned it like that like you are still adding elements to the song in that mixing stage. Because I think that like one thing a lot of people struggle with is knowing when they're done a mix and like when they just need to sit back and like call it a night kind of thing. And when you're adding this element of like, well, we can add some more stuff, it just like, it like totally blows the door out and like you can just do whatever you want and it's like fair game. And so how do you typically know when you're done a mix?
That's like it's almost a philosophical question.
That's fine.
in a way. I mean, and I have to, it's hard to verbalize because it's a feeling that I get. It's funny. It's like, there's just a feeling I get when I know that like the track is just jumping off the speakers in the right way. It's like really impacting me in a way that I love. And I think you have to come to terms with the fact that you may feel like something is never done. It's just human nature to keep working. Like it's our passion, it's our creativity, and we want to keep working on it. We're always going to want to keep working on it. But something that I always try to remember, and I remind my clients all the time, is that this recording is just a slice of where you're at right now. It's not, maybe it dictates where you're going, certainly shows you where you've come from, but really we're in the moment right now. And you could always think to yourself, I could do something better, but you did it in the moment and it's real and it's great. So I just try to remind myself, if I opened a mix from 4 years ago, I probably, mix it in a different way now because I've grown so much over 4 years. It's only natural, but there's a beauty to those mixes when I listen to them from back then, like almost like an innocence where I was like really trying to figure things out. And so, I enjoy that. So when I go to mix, it's just, it's a feeling that I get where I know I'm like, okay, this is it. This is close. Sometimes it's like I nailed it. I got to send it to the client. And other times this is like 95% there. I think we should like bring it to the client now and get their feedback. And then let them help me get that last 5%.
That makes a lot of sense. Cause yeah, when you get to that point where you're like, this is feeling really good, but there's that like, maybe I could do more. Like that's usually like a good spot to stop because yeah, like you said, like they're going to help you with that last 5% and let you know if you are totally out to lunch or if you're in the right ballpark.
Yeah. And there's definitely been times like I'm a pretty good filter of my own work. So there's a lot of times where like, I'll slave over a mix and then maybe I'll go out for dinner and come back and listen and I'll be like, well, wait a second, this mix was better 4 hours ago. And I'll literally like go back to my save as and just go back 4 hours and start again. That definitely happens. You mix yourself into a corner from time to time. You can't really get yourself out of it. Or maybe it was just, I did mention, being goal oriented, but sometimes the goals change, right? Like sometimes you start working on it with a goal in mind and you're like, wait a second, there's actually this other goal that I want to accomplish. And then maybe you have to go back and make some changes based on like this new philosophy towards the mix. That happens too, just sort of being open-minded, but it's hard because as a mixer, you're on your own. It's so rare that I have clients with me. I had Jeff Martin with me while I was mixing for 3 days. We didn't finish the record in 3 days, but that was great because we like super collaborative, in terms of us like kind of working together towards that sort of common goal, which was awesome. Made things go by a lot faster, just in terms of him saying, yeah, I love that, or no, like, let's try to find a different tone. But a lot of times it's just me on my own doing that, pretending I'm the client, thinking like, is this what they're going to love? So,
yeah, it's interesting because I think that when you have that client input, it just gives you a totally different perspective of what you're doing. And, because as engineers, like, we're so attached to it, and we're like, oh, are they gonna like this, or are they not? And sometimes just having that person be like, you know what, you're the expert, you're making this sound great, like, that's like sometimes all you need to hear, right?
Totally. And the other thing that I remind myself of a lot, I mean, it took a while to kind of realize this, was that I am getting hired because of other material that clients have heard that I've worked on. So I know that they're hiring me because I do things a certain way and I make things sound a certain way. So I try not to like deviate too far from the things that I love. Like I'm a massive fan of distortion. I love distorting things. I love distorting drums, bass, vocals. I love putting Sans Amp and Decapitator on everything. I have like a Soundtoys radiator on my mix bus, adding a little bit of distortion to my entire mix. Everything that I do has a bit of a dirty sonic vibe to it. And I find that because I've been doing that for a while, bands are kind of seeking me out for those types of sounds. And they think that, their material would work with that type of mix in mind. So I think maybe that makes it a little bit easier for me in terms of knowing when I'm finished and in terms of pleasing the clients, because because they are aware of what I've worked on in the past.
Yeah. So you'd mentioned having goals when you start a project. Like, what, in your opinion, what makes a great mix? Like, what are your goals trying to get you to?
I guess, and maybe this question might be a little bit genre specific. Okay. Just in terms of, me being more of a rock mixer and but a little bit of like blues and roots and things. So I like a lot of it's going to come down to vocals. Making sure that the vocal is clear and present and sort of just right within the track so that everyone can hear the lyrics. Like I think I have to think about people that listen to music casually. I think what they take away or what they would take away from a song would be lyrics and melody. So I need to make sure that you can hear all of that and that it's clear, but also, in terms of rock music, it's sort of that bigness, the larger than life feeling that you get when you listen to a rock track. Like if you remember the first time you heard like Paradise City or Sweet Emotion or any of those, or like Black Dog, and just that immediacy of like how everything is just so in your face. It's not just the vocal that's in your face. It's the kick drum and the snare drum and the bass and the guitars panned wide and like super big. So yeah, I mean, those are all elements that go into like a really good rock mix for me is getting the, I guess first maybe getting the drums to like really speak in a good way. And I use the phrase like jump off the speakers a lot, because when you get it to the point where it's that exciting that it feels like it's jumping off the speakers, then you're in a good spot, or at least I know I'm in a good spot. But I mean, again, there's so many factors into what makes a good mix, but it also sort of fuels the way that I mix. Like I used to, when I was on a console, I would solo certain elements, I'd maybe like start with the kick drum and solo and EQ it. But I started to realize, and it only hit me when I was working in the box more, that's not the best way to do it, because sure, I can make a kick drum sound amazing, but what difference does it make, if it's not within the context of the song? So now I tend to just get my rough mix going through my mix bus always. So I'm mixing through the mix bus because the mix bus is all in the box and it kind of acts as your console in the box. So that sound is something I'm very familiar with. I've sort of crafted it over the last 5 years since I've started mixing in the box. And so I'll just get my rough mix going and then I'll start working on elements. I might work on the kick drum. I won't solo it. I'll work on it in place with all the rest of my tracks. But then I might jump to the bass and get it to like really sit nicely with the kick drum, and then maybe I go to the snare, but almost always I'll get the vocal in really early, like get it sounding the way I want it to sound, and then craft the rest of the mix around the vocal. Because again, going back to what I said a couple minutes ago, like really is important to hear the vocal. So it's deciding on the vocal treatment. I use a lot of delays. Lately, I've never been much of a reverb guy. Definitely like more like slapback delays to kind of get room sounds and things like that. But some of the UAD plugins that they've come out with in the last little while, like reverb wise, like the Capital Room or the Capital Chamber, sorry, is like unreal. It's such good reverb that it like sounds good, and I found myself using it now, like using more reverbs on mixes just because it does sound really nice. But yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm being like
that's
your question.
No, that's pretty cool. It's a good insight into what you're doing and like your approach to it, and I definitely agree with you. And I think we have a lot of similar approaches to it. You had mentioned drums, and one of the things that I've always really admired about your productions is the sound of your drums. They always sound massive, like especially like your kick and snare. I've always found that you've somehow managed to master the art of getting them to sound really fat and full and beefy, but then like with a good amount of transient as well, and it just bites through the heavy stuff, but it doesn't sound muddy or get buried in the mix or like drown out other stuff. Like what's I was wondering if you could maybe give some detail in terms of your process behind, maybe that's something that you kind of determine early on when you're tracking or in your mixing stages. Like what's your typical process look like when you're doing drums?
Yeah, I mean, to me, like, it's funny being a guitar player, and I mean, this maybe ties back to one of your first questions about how being a guitar player influences me in the studio. For me, it was always kind of easy to get guitar sounds. I wouldn't say easy. I don't think that's ever a good word to use in the studio necessarily, but like, I didn't find it as challenging because I'd heard guitar my whole life, coming from amplifiers and how my guitar would fit in with bands when I was playing with bands. So that to me was something that came very naturally. But drums is something that is somewhat unnatural. And even the way that we unnatural to me, but the way that we mic drums is kind of unnatural too. I mean, we put mics super close to the source. Like we would never put our ear next to a snare drum. That'd be crazy. So we're used to hearing drums in a room, as people so the room sound plays a lot into what I do, in terms of getting drums. I know there's been, especially in modern rock, there's there was a trend for a while to have like a lot of sample based drums, super tight rooms. Like you didn't really hear the room so much. And it was just like kicks and snares that sounded like they were cutting through and they were a little hyped and I would say unnatural, but it's sort of what served those, massive like detuned guitars and kind of worked. But I've always been in love with, kind of roomier sounds. And that's something that I still strive to get, whether I'm recording, producing, or mixing. Don't get me wrong. I still use drum samples on every project. Well, almost every project I work on, just lightly. I'll put them in. But a lot of it is, can I get the drums to sound great in the room? If I'm out in the room and I hear that the drums sound great, it doesn't matter what mics I'm using. It doesn't matter how close or far they are from the kit. It doesn't matter if I use one mic in front of the kit or I use 18 mics on the kit. Like a good sounding kit in a good sounding room is always going to sound good. It's hard to mess that up. So I like to bring a drum tech in when I'm producing. I use a wonderful human being named James Forsyth, who happens to work with Our Lady Peace. He's their tech on the road. And he's got an amazing old Gretsch kit that makes it onto like 90% of all of my recordings. So the drums that you hear are usually this old Gretsch kit that he's kept in amazing shape. And he understands how drums need to sound in a room, his experience sort of tuning drums, in arenas, and clubs and things like that. Like it really, really helps me in the studio, and I can give him direction, and he'll, tune the drums in certain ways that I, so that I can hear the drums speak properly for the song. But then even when I'm mixing, I'll use tools to enhance the rooms. Like going back to the UAD stuff, they make this amazing Ocean Way plugin where they basically sampled the Ocean Way studios, and you can place the drums sort of in the Ocean Way room. And I'll use that a ton. If I get mixes where the room mics need to be enhanced, so that I can kind of create the sounds that I hear in my head, the sort of the roominess. But I think a lot of what maybe you were hearing and you so kindly pointed out about my drum sounds, a lot of it comes in the mix. I lean more towards parallel compression than I do towards compressing individual elements. So for example, I'll have a kick drum track that I may not compress. I may not actually insert a compressor on it. If the drummer's really good and it doesn't need like dynamic help, if the drummer's dynamic all on their own, then I can sort of route that kick through a series of parallel buses. And each mix I do, I'll have several drum parallel buses that I can run a signal or a track to at any given time. So I have one that's like a tape-based saturation plugin. It's the UAD Studer plugin. And then I'll have a couple different compressors, like a mono compressor for kick and snare, and then a stereo compressor for like rooms and things. And then I might have a couple buses that are just like sort of special effect type things that I can get weird with. Like there's the I can't remember who makes it. It might be a company called Good Hurts, but it's like the Wolfpack. Wolfpack. That band's drum plugin is unreal. I mean, it's so gnarly and cool, and you can lo-fi things, and so I might have that. And what it's allowing me to do is keep the natural transients, so that you're hearing the kick as if it was played. I'm not altering the immediate transients, but then I'm like slamming parallel with parallel buses and then bringing those back into the mix for taste. So it's like really enhancing the sounds that are there, but allowing the transients to still breathe, which I think is important. Like when you listen to Zeppelin, like the dynamics in Bonham's footwork and how he handled the snares and how heavy he was of a player. And I think if you compressed the crap out of that kick drum, it just wouldn't sound right. It's letting it breathes. It always breathes. And so, even though we're living in more of a modern time where, guitars are super big and we're layering way more guitars than any producer would have had the ability to do in the 70s. But for me, I want it to sound honest and real. So that sort of the experimenting with parallel buses really helps me keep that sense of realism, but still put it in a modern context.
I love that. Yeah, I think it's something that a lot of people will add like one parallel bus because they just hear parallel compression, so they just think one parallel channel is all you need. But I like that approach of being able to like have those different layers of it and find that blend while keeping the original transients and stuff in there. Because like I think a lot about like the drums, for example, for like Moneen or Circa Survive, like those records there, like I love how the kick and snare sound on those ones. And
yes,
and that's something that like I know you only worked on the one Moneen album, right?
Yeah, we did the last one.
Yeah, but I've always found that at least in their productions, they've always had a lot of like bite on the snare, and I feel like when they started working with you, they definitely amplified that a little bit more and like got the bite out of it, still fat sounds, and I love the sound of that stuff. So kudos to you, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That was fun, man. That was like, I remember we did the drums at Metalworks, and like the only they had kind of a deadline because they were going to tour in Australia. So we had like a couple months to get the record done. And we like literally went into Metalworks. It was like the 1st of January of whatever that year was. And we had like 2 days to get 14 beds done. And it was awesome. I mean, working with those guys was, they're some of the most talented and nicest people that you could ever work with.
That's awesome. So speaking of Moneen, one of the things that I've always really admired about their records, and I was curious to get your input on kind of the story about it, but I've always found that they've had a great amount of detail in like how they use effects and like creating the ambience and creating the space and using the delays and changing the times and all that stuff to get these crazy sounds. Like what's that process look like from the production standpoint? Like, is that something that like those guys just know what they're doing, they're coming in with that, or are you just like spending some time in the studio being like, guys, let's just fuck around with stuff and get these awesome sounds?
I think like with that band in particular, they're like super organized. Like, Kenny and Hippie both, they sort of came into the sessions sort of knowing how they wanted the guitars to sound. And certainly Hippie, like he uses a lot of effects and a lot of like interesting pitch shifters and delays and he just like, he's sort of a master of those pedals. He's an incredible guitar player, super unique. I don't know that I've ever worked with anyone quite like him. Just in terms of like his melodic sensibilities and his approach to, to writing his parts, but he's also a master of like what he has on his pedal board. Like he really knows how things are going to react on his pedal board. And so that kind of made it, again, I don't like to use the word easy, but it was very natural. There was never like, I get, this was a while ago, so I don't remember everything about it, but I remember, us walking away every day thinking, wow, that was really inspiring. I think from a production standpoint, I learned a lot as a producer on that record in particular, because I had never really used that many effects on guitars, and I had never really used, I'd never really thought about guitars in that sort of ambient sense. And that's something I took away, how to sort of like weave pedals together to create sort of really interesting, unique sounds. And sometimes random. That's what's cool about it. When you do, when you run a delay pedal into a pitch shifter, into a reverb, and you hit some chords, every time you do it, it's going to be slightly different. And that sort of randomness is super cool. Something I still use to this day, where, even if it's like a rootsier record, I'll always create some kind of ambience with guitars. And it really goes back to, working with Kenny and Hippie in the studio on those sounds. It's pretty cool.
That's awesome. Another thing I really admire about a lot of your recordings is the low end. And I think it may be, you had mentioned that back in the day, you were really into like a lot of like the Motown stuff, and that was kind of your upbringing. And then you wanted to work with David Bottrill to learn more about the heavier side. And he's a master of getting like those big, full, heavy, beefy tones. When it comes to getting the low end right, what are some of your tips for that?
I think for me, it's having a set of speakers that I really know intimately. I think you can't get the low end right if you don't really have that, a solid relationship with your monitors, because you'll always be guessing. So I've got a set of monitors, and you can't see them obviously over the podcast. They're called Spiral Groove Studio Ones, and a mastering engineer friend of mine, Brian Lucy, turned me on to them a number of years ago. And they're made out of bamboo. They're really small, but the bottom end is very impressive on them and very honest. There's no hyping whatsoever. So I can really, almost without a sub, which blows my mind, because if you saw how small they were, they're like little like bookshelf speakers. If you saw how small they were, you'd say there's no way you're mixing on those speakers. But I can really tell, I can tell how far I'm able to push bottom end. And I think these days things have a ton of bottom. I mean, it's almost like, we're in rock music, we're taking a cue from the urban side of things and like using subs more and sub frequencies, I should say, like on a kick drum and a bass to really bring those lows out. So I think it's just, it's just a matter of me really like understanding and not overdoing the bottom end. I'll always do the car test. I'll take my mix out to the car and make sure it's not too bottom heavy. I think that's probably one of the most difficult things in mixing is shaping the bottom and getting it to work properly and not muddy up everything else and be just right. So I think probably because I think that way, I focus on it a lot when I'm mixing. And then sometimes it's not being afraid to like cut some bottom end out if it's not needed. I do like things that like live around 60 hertz, but sometimes it's better if they live around 120 hertz instead of 60 hertz and like, filtering out some of the subs to kind of get the 120 to kind of, be more impactful is sometimes what's necessary. But I think everything goes back to those speakers, and I'll often tell sort of young mixers, like if you don't understand your speakers or you don't have, if it, like a lot of sort of entry level monitors, I find hype the bottom end a lot. So I would say, don't mix on headphones, but if there's a pair of headphones that really well, check your bottom end on those headphones, check in the car. I also check on my laptop speakers to make sure, because I am shaping the bottom end. I want to make sure that there's still enough attack in the bass so that you can hear the note definition, and there's still, a fair amount of point to the kick drum so that it doesn't disappear when you translate to the laptop speakers. So I think there's factors that make up those sounds, and they might not just be bottom end. It might be like, how do you shape the mid range so that, when a kid listens to a song for the first time on their phone without headphones, you can still hear the kick drum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice. I like that. I think you nailed it. Like, it really just comes down to understanding your monitors. And even if you do have those monitors that hype up the low end, I still feel like you could still make great mixes on those monitors as long as you understand what you're hearing out of them.
100%. And like, no, I don't mean to like, sort of belittle those types of monitors because they're important. And I've mixed, I had a pair of Atom A7s for a lot of my career that I absolutely loved. Then I moved to a studio where they just didn't work for whatever reason. I had to get another pair of monitors. They didn't sound right in the room, which has a large play in to how your monitors sound is, like if they're too big for your room, then you'll never be able to judge the bottom end. But I think you're right. It is helpful to me. Like I've got a pair of those Avantones, which are like the sort of, the newer Oratones, just for, hearing how things might sound outside of the studio, although they don't go very low, but you can still judge the bottom on them. There's I think an endless way of checking mixes these days, which is really
for sure.
Cool.
Yeah. So for people who might be just getting started out with mixing and getting into it, what advice would you have for someone like that?
I think the best advice is listen to as much music as possible. Be open-minded to all types of music. That's maybe the one thing I look back on my career, and because I'm such a rock guy, I'm so passionate about rock music that like it maybe keeps me from other projects almost to a fault. But hey, it's what I love doing, and I'm like passionate about it. So it's worked out. But I think these days, being able to do multiple things is always good. Be true to yourself and, push yourself always, and maybe understand where you are in the process. I always knew, and I never really lied to myself. I always kind of knew where I was, and I knew that it would take time in my career to get to the point where I wanted to be. And I think it's, I think it's important to sort of enjoy the ride. You know, it's kept my career for the last 18 years super interesting. And it's sort of, I mean, to go back to the basketball game last night, I don't know if you heard Nick Nurse in his press conference after the game. Someone asked him, you know, he didn't take the typical approach to becoming an NBA coach. He had to kind of move around being a coach in sort of like college divisions and things, and then sort of made his way to being a head coach. And they asked, you know, if it ever bothered him that he had to come that way. And he said that he enjoyed every job, you know, in the moment, that he never wished for anything more, that he was just passionate about getting the wins in those jobs. And to me, that's really interesting because it really resonated, you know, with my philosophies. Always been the same. You know, sure, when I was younger, I always dreamed about working with, you know, my favorite bands, because who doesn't? But, you know, I wasn't at a point where I could work with those bands. And so it was really like, you know, every project I worked on was a learning experience to get myself to the point where I could work with the bands that I really wanted to work with. And I was honest the whole time, every step of the way. And it took a while to get where I wanted to be, but I stuck to it, you know, and stuck with it and always pushed myself. So I think my advice to someone, you know, that's just starting out is try to find a way to stay inspired all the time. Take on as much work as you can, because you're only going to get better with each mix. So, you know, even if it's, you know, if you don't have clients at any given time, go and find, you know, some tracks that you can mix. Or if if you're friends with a band that has tracks that need to be mixed, or maybe they've had it mixed already, but they'll give you the tracks to play with and experiment with. You know, the more mixes you do, the quicker you'll sort of come into your own. And I think that's maybe the best advice I can give.
For sure. I love that. That's great. I definitely agree with all of that, because you're right. Like, the more you work on stuff, the better you're going to get. And it just takes time. You can't expect to just jump in and be working with those all-stars, like you said, you know?
Yeah, no. And that's it. And it's just being honest. You know, I think if you're passionate about something and you love it and you work tirelessly at it, eventually you'll get to the point where you want to be. You know, for some people it happens quick. For other people it takes time. But I think you always have to look back and treat each new project as a success, you know, and learn. You know, there's only a certain amount of people in the world that these days can kind of make a living working in music. You know, it's not as booming as it once was, I'm sure. Most people are aware. So I think if you can make somewhat of a living doing this, then you're incredibly successful. You know, and that's kind of how you have to look at it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So we should probably start to wrap up, because I know that you're taking time out of mixing today to have this chat. So I don't want to keep you, but how can people follow you online and learn more about you?
Yeah, I think, you know, just hit up my website, brianmoncarz.com. You'll not a ton of stuff there, but you'll hear, you know, you'll hear some of my favorite pieces of work and my bios there. But I am pretty great with posting to Instagram. I'm just at Moncarz. And also my personal Facebook, you know, add me on Facebook. It's just Brian Moncarz. Find me there, and I don't post on Facebook as much as I should, but I'm still there. But Instagram, I'm like almost daily posting stuff. So, you know, stuff from my sessions. I did some videos for Pure Mix, so there's like links for that stuff on there. And yeah,
awesome, cool.
That's where I am.
That's wicked. And lastly, any cool projects that you're working on now that you want to talk about or that you can share about? Yeah,
there's a couple of things in the works. I mean, I think I'm really excited. Yesterday, I just got back the masters for the new Tea Party album. That was a lot of work. So to kind of hear it finished was super exciting for me yesterday. And I had such a blast working with that band. I mean, they're so talented. So to work with Jeff in the studio was definitely a career highlight for me. So that's really exciting. I'm not quite sure when the album will come out, but they just released the second single last week. So you can check that out. I'm also really excited to be mixing sort of a blues rock artist named Philip Sace, who's probably one of my favorite guitar players around. He's just such an inspiring guitar player, but also has an amazing voice and is a really great songwriter. Oddly enough, Phil and I grew up in like neighboring high schools in Toronto. So we have like a real personal connection that goes back many, many, many years. And we sort of fell out of touch. He moved to LA and sort of, he ended up playing guitar for Melissa Etheridge for a long time. And now he's doing the solo thing again. And we reconnected at a show a few years ago of his and kind of rekindled our friendship, which was super cool. So I'm really excited to get to work with him. I mean, to me, it's just an awesome thing. And then I've got a few developing projects that I'm really excited about. A young Toronto band called The Fame that I'm producing, that are starting to do really well, getting some like great shows. And Brandon, the main singer-songwriter, I think is a uniquely talented songwriter. He's young and he's just going to grow into something pretty special. I'm finishing up mixes right now for a band from Nanaimo that I produced, called Wise Young Blood, that I'm also really excited about. It has kind of the cult meets Arctic Monkeys vibe to it, which I think is really interesting. And then I just had for a week up at the chalet where my studio is, I just had a band from out east called Andre Petipa and the Giants. And again, like really great songwriting. And that was fun because they came and lived actually like in the studio. There's rooms that bands can rent. So they were here for 7 days living and breathing their album, which was good fun. So that won't get mixed until the end of August, but yeah, lots of stuff on the go, some mixing projects, some production projects, really keeps things interesting for me. So
that's great. I'm looking forward to hearing all of that stuff. Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for being on here. I think that, man, you got some awesome tips that you gave in this episode. So I'm super stoked to have had you on here. And it was a pleasure to finally get to meet with you and chat.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you searching me out and having me on your podcast. It's awesome.
No worries, man. Well, thank you so much. And we'll talk soon. So that was my interview with Brian Moncarz. Was I right at the beginning of this episode or what? When I said that it would be an awesome episode. I had a lot of fun chatting with Brian. He's just such a cool, chill dude, and he shared a lot of really cool stories and great advice. I really loved hearing about working with Moneen because the record that he worked on is one of my favorite records, so super cool to get to hear some behind-the-scenes stuff about that. And I also found his parallel bus process to be really interesting. The fact that he uses so many different parallel buses and makes them all work together. I think that that's really, really cool and something that I'm personally going to try on my next mix, and you should too. That's what this is all about. That's why I make these episodes, because I think there's so many great tips that get shared. And by listening to these people and experimenting and taking action and trying these things out, we can all improve our mixes. So I would love to hear the results that you guys get as a result of trying some of the tips that Brian gave in this episode. So that's a wrap for this episode. And as always, guys, if this is your first time listening to the Master Your Mix podcast, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com. And if you go to that page right now, I'm giving away a free copy of what I call the Ultimate Mixing Blueprint, which is a guide to using EQ and compression in your mixes. And it's going to help you get up and running really, really quickly. And you're not going to have to question which frequencies you should boost or cut, because it's going to clearly lay it all out for you and make things really easy for you. And also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review on iTunes. There's been some awesome reviews that people have been leaving, and I love seeing them. So keep it coming, guys. This definitely helps to spread the word, let people know more about the MasterYourMix podcast, and just really help get more music put out there. Because I really do believe that the more music you create, the bigger impact you can make, whether that's in your own career or it's helping others, all that kind of stuff. That's really the reason why I have created MasterYourMix and why I do this podcast. I really want to see more music come out and see people making an impact and inspiring others. So yeah, that's it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to talk to you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Thanks for listening to the MasterYourMix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit masteryourmix.com.